That's why we brought jumpers.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. To all of you here, and to those who are watching through the camera. We come now to the Bible story session number 30, with the Seleucid kings and some library books. Well, for many years, the Jews in Judea had lived under the Greek authority of the Ptolemies in Egypt without any trouble. But in that year, 198 BCE, they found themselves under the authority of new masters, the Greek family of Seleucids, who had similarly emerged, like the Ptolemies, at the end of the chaos following Alexander's death in 323. Like the Ptolemies, who'd built the new city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, King Seleucus in Syria had founded and built the new city of Antioch on the northern coast, which he had named in honor of his father Antiochus. Nowadays, of course, it's known as Antiochia, and it's in the realm of Turkey, where the earthquake happened not so long ago. The two new cities, Alexandria and Antioch, flourished and became very important through the new trading links with Greece. Well, as I said, the new king, also after the Battle of Panium, King Antiochus III, the Great, became king of Syria. He fought and won all the eastern coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, that included Jerusalem. As I've said, at first there seemed to be no difference. Life in Jerusalem carried on as before, with the priests dominating society and all the intelligentsia. There was still no question about their loyalty to the monotheistic faith, even though they were all attracted to the Greeks and their way of life. The nearest temptation to flirting with the Greek gods and goddesses had been their personification of wisdom, but that was all. Jewish wisdom remained firmly in favor of God's law enshrined in the Torah, the Pentateuch, which was by now finalized and become scripture. Well, life in Jerusalem during these times was awe-inspiring to the many pilgrims who came. They found themselves overwhelmed by the glorious daily processions and the rituals of the priests of the temple. Many Jews, however, were beginning to migrate from Judea. Many had already settled in Alexandria, attracted by work in the university and library, as well as for the flourishing trade with Ethiopia and southern Africa. Now, more Jews migrated to Antioch and became a significant colony there. In fact, Jews were migrating to many significant trading centres all around the eastern half of the Mediterranean. Let's have a look at the map. There you are, the eastern end of the Mediterranean. You can see Egypt in the south, Greece, top left, Turkey, and then the Babylonian Empire going down towards Persia. Can you find the city of Damascus? Good. Right up further north in the corner of the Mediterranean coastline is Antioch. That was the new city for the people of Syria. So Antioch and Alexandria are the two great cities. But trading was very, very popular with Cyprus, which isn't mentioned there. If you continue westwards, round the coastline, you come to Ephesus, a very, very great Jewish centre developed there. And then, of course, if you cross to the mainland, to Athens, Corinth, and places like that, Philippi, Jews went there to trade. and settled in communities within the Greek communities there. It was a very, very great migration, all helped by the fact that they all talked the same language. They could just move freely from one place to another and settle where they wanted. They became known as the diaspora, or the dispersion, and gradually they all abandoned their Aramaic language in favour of the universal Greek. They didn't merge into their new communities, however. They kept themselves separate, never eating with non-Jews because of their dietary laws. Remember the significant one, never to eat pork. They preserved their Jewish identity, always circumcising their young sons and keeping their monotheistic faith and Sabbath customs, but their synagogues were now all Greek-speaking, as were the psalms they sang and the sacred writings of the Torah. Thanks to all those scholars who'd worked so hard in the university and library at Alexandria. All Jews everywhere paid their annual temple tax, and they felt as if they actually belonged when they travelled to Jerusalem for one of the great pilgrim festivals. It was that tax that held them all together as a Jewish community wherever they happened to live. But as the generations came and went, the Hebrew language fell almost out of use and was soon unknown to many of them. Well, back in Syria, the Seleucid kings had become more and more attracted, like Alexander before them, to the glamour of the old Persian court. With its displays of Oriental culture, but now without the tensions of war, and both communities benefited from each other. The Greeks took their Hellenism to Persia, where many Greek-style cities had been built, with all their attractions for the enjoyment of citizens, particularly the theatres, and they were themselves attracted by the fascinating culture they found, which was unknown in the West, and particularly, to give one example, their beautiful gardens. Even we have been dazzled by In the Persian Garden. It's an entirely new concept, always with a water feature in the middle, with beautiful walkways, usually pillared colonnades in which they could shade from the sun. And every different garden was unique, but they all had these same features in them. The Persian garden. They found the old mythic stories of ancient Babylon, in particular, if you remember, the epics of the Enuma-Elish creation and Gilgamesh of the flood, which had already been adapted into the Jews' book of Genesis. And in addition, from the more modern Babylon, they'd learnt about the zodiac. They'd learnt about astrology and fortune-telling. And with the coming of scientific knowledge, the beginnings of astronomy and cosmology. Well, from Persia, the Greeks also found the glorious stories of the Arabian Nights, with all their seductive need always to know the next one, in the tradition of the Haji. And more important for our studies, they learnt about the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, just as the Jews had done before them. And just to give you a brief reminder of that religion, it was a simpler faith than lots and lots of gods and goddesses. They believed in only two gods, one of light, one of darkness, good, evil. The one named Ahura Mazda for the light, and the other Angra Mainyu for the dark. The many old gods, of course, hadn't disappeared. You can't get rid of them. They'd been demoted to the level of what I call godlets. Not quite gods anymore. But of course, these turned into servants of the light and the darkness in the form of angels to the good and demons or evil spirits to the bad. Their writing style, remember, was the apocalyptic style, which we met for quite a long time in the Old Testament, describing the events in heaven, very imaginative writing, but describing heaven above the earth and foretelling the catastrophic end time when all would come to an end with final judgment and the final defeat of evil. That was the Zoroastrian faith. Now, most of these ideas had already infiltrated Judaism, and now they were beginning to challenge the ideas of the Greeks and their gods of Mount Olympus. Well, the results of all this cross-fertilization of ideas and the universal ability of even ordinary people to read the Greek language led to a result that is of interest to all biblical scholars like us. This was a craving everywhere for more and more library books for people to borrow, read, enjoy, and discuss, in Jerusalem as everywhere else. The Jews enjoyed them all, but were more impressed and most impressed by those stories which spoke in terms of Jewish wisdom, the law, and the moral behavior of their own faith in the one and only God who created everything that existed. So much so that several of these stories found their way into a permanent place amongst their scriptures, becoming the third section of the Old Testament. We already have the law, or the Torah, finalized in the Pentateuch. We already have an almost completed collection of the prophets' writings. There's still a few more to come until we get to the book of Daniel, which was the last. And now we're beginning to have a third collection of various religious writings. And how to describe them? Well, they called them the writings. So we now describe the Old Testament as being full of the law, the prophets, and the writings, as a summary to give to other people. Well, now let's have a look at some of them. And I'll suggest that they will be very enjoyable stories for bedtime. And when I say that, I say if you read them, don't read them intensely, trying to absorb every little feature. Do what I do, skim read. Cast your eyes over the text. If you see anything interesting, read it. And that's how you get the essence of the stories. So don't be afraid to skip over the bits that aren't interesting and pick out the bits that are. Let's have a look first at the book of Ruth. Its present position in the Old Testament comes before the collection of the Deuteronomic history books and is a story about King David's grandmother. It made a serious point. This was for all the separatists to remember in Jerusalem, that even their highly honoured King David, no less, had a non-Jewish grandmother. A lesson to remember that God had called them not to keep completely separate, but to be his servant to the rest of the world. But do enjoy the tear-jerking beauty of Ruth's words to her mother-in-law, Naomi. Naomi was going home and wanted Ruth to stay in her own country. But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, there will I be buried." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And you must read on for the rest of the story. Next one, the book of Jonah. This was written by an author with an outrageous sense of humour. He wrote about Jonah, who tried to get away from his call from God, only to be swallowed by a big fish and then be regurgitated to start again from the beginning. But it has a serious lesson. And that seems equally outrageous. Because when the people of Nineveh responded to Jonah's warnings and urgings to repent, they actually did. They repented. So much so that God repented and forgave them and didn't destroy them as he said he would. And the story then continues with Jonah's anger that God hadn't done what he said he was going to do. And of course, Jonah had to be taught a lesson there. And it was a very, very profound lesson on the real nature of forgiveness. So again, a book worth reading. Third one is the story of Esther. And if you haven't enjoyed this one before, it's well worth it. She was an orphan who won a beauty competition and became the queen of Persia, no less. It's a compulsive read from start to finish, during which the Queen's intervention saved the lives of all her people, the Jews. The Jews who lived in Susa and the provinces from the danger of annihilation by the Persian courtier Haman. Now, God is not even mentioned in this story, but it earned its place in the Old Testament writings by explaining the origins of the Jewish feast of Purim. But again, a very, very enjoyable read. Next, we have a collection of miraculous stories about Daniel. Daniel from the time of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Some of the stories are now written into the first 7 chapters of his book. But other stories of Daniel can be found in the Apocrypha, especially in the book of Bel and the Dragon, an early whodunit, with Daniel as the original Sherlock Holmes, asking, "Does an idol eat?" You'll find out when you read. And then it continues with the story of Daniel in the lion's den. The dragon, of course, later became the prototype for the dragon in the New Testament book of Revelation, chapter 12. And some now even claim the origin of the story of St. George and the dragon. Anyway, back to the Apocrypha. We come to the story of Susanna, who took a bath in her husband's garden. Do you remember that beautiful water feature we saw? Every Persian garden had a feature like that. And Susanna had all the doors locked so that she could take a bath. But this is a tale of trumped-up charges by reliable citizens, witnesses against Susanna's reputation. And remember, women didn't count for very much. But her prayer to God, when condemned to die, was answered by God, who spurred, and I quote, spurred a young lad named Daniel to the rescue. And the story hinges on a pun, which is now lost, I'm afraid, in its meaning, in the translation of 2 types of tree. But by the end of the story, Susanna's reputation was restored, and the villains met their fate. Well, there are 2 more books for us to consider. The sensuous story of Judith. If you've never read it, sir, worth a read. It's in praise of a strong, feisty woman who dealt decisively with her lover. Her story starts in chapter 8 of the book that bears her name, but read there, and it's very reminiscent of the story of Jael in the book of Judges, chapters 4 and 5. I leave you to that. Enjoy that one yourself. But lastly, there's the delightful tale of Tobit, which incorporates a second story, the second story being that of Tobias and the angel. For me, this is the best of all these stories. It's set in the diaspora and tells of the old man Tobit, now old and blind, who sent his son Tobias to reclaim an old debt owing to him from his friend in Media. There's a parallel story of his relative Raguel, whose beautiful daughter Sarah is in the clutches of the wicked demon Asmodeus, who killed each one of her 7 new bridegrooms before they could get into the nuptial bed. So she was still a virgin. Sarah was tempted to suicide, but knew it would bring disgrace on her beloved father, so she prayed to God and asked for help. Well, the reader is made privy to the plot. In chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, we find that it takes on the character of an old folk tale. Tobias meets a stranger called Azariah, who's really the archangel Raphael in disguise. Raphael, the archangel, the healer. Well, he was in the equivalent position of the necessary fairy godmother in the tale, who went with Tobias and taking his pet dog with him, the only pet dog we ever meet in the Bible. They collected magical charms on the way, a gallbladder, a heart, and a liver, very useful medicinal items, and all at Raphael's instruction. And they used them in the course of the story to great effect. Well, read and enjoy. It's just like the Arabian Nights. Yes, Tobias did marry Sarah, and he survived. The newly dug grave was unused, as the curse was broken thanks to Raphael's magical healing powers. And then, while everyone settled down to enjoy the lengthy marriage feast over a matter of weeks, Raphael left with his dog, journeyed to Media, and reclaimed old Tobit's debt. He returned, rejoined Tobias and Sarah for the journey home, where the last medicinal item effectively restored old Tobit's sight. The climax comes in chapter 12, when old Tobit wondered how much to pay the unknown stranger for all he had done. And he decided it was worth a 50-50 split in all he had. And then in chapter 12, Raphael revealed his true identity. And I quote, "I am Raphael, one of the 7 angels who stand ready and enter before the glory of the Lord. When I was with you, I was not acting on my own will, but by the will of God." And then there's a very interesting note to prove his identity. And I quote again, "Although you were watching me, I really did not eat or drink anything. What you saw was a vision. So now get up from the ground and acknowledge God." And please take note as I continue quoting, Raphael continued, "See, I am ascending to him who sent me." And he ascended. Sorry. They stood up, they could see him no more. Now, why do I say take note? Well, it's because St. Luke used this same story in chapter 24 of his Gospel, when the disciples were so bewildered by the appearance of the risen Christ and thought they were seeing an angel. And to prove he wasn't an angel, the risen Jesus asked for something to eat. And I quote from chapter 24 of the Gospel, "They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence." Well, I hope it will not now be too much of a shock when we reach the Gospels in the New Testament, and I tell you that they are all wisdom documents with very important teachings about God built into them. Well, we must resist the temptation to jump ahead to the Gospel writers. We must return to our Syrian story, for we have another 200 years to cover first, with lots more stories to tell. Back in Judea, the troubles when they started were not all the fault of the Seleucids. It was also partly the fault of the opposing factions in Jerusalem society, with their jealousies and rivalries, and now we must become aware of them again. We now have several sources for our information: the books of the Maccabees, the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, as well as some of the papyri of Ptolemy II in Egypt. The story concerns two families in particular who were very influential in Jerusalem. One was the wealthy family of Tobiah and his 7 sons, not to be confused with Tobias of the story we talked about just now. This is real. Tobiah and his 7 sons, who'd grown very rich collecting taxes for the Ptolemies of Egypt until the Battle of 198. These people are known collectively as the Tobiads, and they were ready to challenge the authority of the Syrian regime at every opportunity because they'd lost their source of income. But the other family was that of the high priestly family of Onias, and they're known as the Oniads. They were very conservative leaders whose concern was to preserve the religious status quo and object to any hint of change. Well, when the new king Antiochus III marched south to claim his new territories, the high priest, whose name was Onias III, welcomed Antiochus III at the gates of the Jerusalem and offered no resistance at all. Welcome. Antiochus was very impressed and gave orders for money and materials to be available for the temple restoration fund, and even bought some animals to be sacrificed on his behalf. He then affirmed all the Greeks' privileges to the Jews, allowing them to keep their monotheistic faith, all their religious customs, and to keep their own code of law. He even then proclaimed that all the temple personnel were to be exempted from paying taxes for the next 3 years, and issued an edict that all non-Jews should keep away from the temple courts on pain of death. Well, it looked as if all would be well. So it might have been, but for the undercurrents amongst the Jews themselves, which were laying the fuses for trouble to come. First among them were the Tobiads, rich but now out of work. Then there were the other rich families who could now afford to travel abroad, to visit relatives in the diaspora. They were experiencing for themselves the delights of Greek culture, especially in the theatres, the games, and all the new fashions, especially in their clothes. The youngsters in particular were absolutely full of enthusiasm. Some of them even tried to reverse the circumcision surgery to avoid the ridicule they received in the gymnasium and in the games. But they were also fascinated by the young men's guilds that were springing up everywhere. One such guild was known as the Ephebian, whose members wore a very distinctive dress to show that they belonged. Perhaps the 2nd century Hells Angels. Their costume consisted of a very wide-brimmed hat, a cloak fastened with brooches at the shoulders, and high-laced boots. Sounds rather like the Three Musketeers, don't you think? But they were all now well educated in the Greek style. They read many good storybooks and also books of Greek philosophy and science. This new way of life was full of vitality and excitement. There was thus a culture shock for them when they returned to Jerusalem, closed off to some extent from the world by the conservative politics of their leaders, and so urged on by the separatist people. In fact, the whole city seemed very dead, old-fashioned, and unexciting. Change, I'm afraid, was inevitable. But it wasn't only the young and wealthy who were noticing the changes. The stay-at-home folk who were also affected by the many travellers who were passing through Judea to the north and in the opposite direction to the south. So these stay-at-home people had to learn to speak Greek as well in order to do business. Well, the troubles when they erupted came suddenly and dramatically in the year 167 BCE, the climax of all sorts of events which you don't have to remember, so just listen. Antiochus III had earned his title the Great for his conquests and his magnificent building programs in Syria. But 8 years after conquering Judea, he was caught up in a battle against the new power rising in the western part of the Mediterranean world, Rome. Rome objected to the fact that Antiochus in Syria had given sanctuary to Hannibal after his defeat at Carthage in the Punic Wars. And Rome wanted revenge. It was disastrous. Antiochus lost the battle at Magnesia in 190 BC. He was forced by Rome to pay a huge indemnity, which completely impoverished him. Rome also demanded 20 hostages to be delivered to Rome. Among them was Antiochus's youngest son, Antiochus, also named Antiochus. Well, the old Antiochus III was now a broken man, and he died 3 years later. He was succeeded by his older son, Seleucus IV, who reigned uneventfully for 12 years before being murdered by his chief minister, Heliodorus. Prince Antiochus heard this news while he was in Rome, where he was being held hostage. He had gained a wary and very healthy respect there for this new emerging power, but Rome did give him permission to return to Syria as their potential friend. Once there, back home in Syria, he wasted no time. He took charge. He murdered his nephew, the new king, and then dispatched Heliodorus before establishing himself as King Antiochus IV of Syria. This was in the year 175 BCE, and it soon became obvious that trouble would come. The new king proved to be a very high-spirited, impulsive, very unpredictable man, to the extent of being half mad. And I've told you before, he gave himself the nickname Epiphanes, the exposure of a human god. He was occupied with these grand ideas, but concerned with Egypt for the next 8 years, until he turned his attention to Jerusalem in the year 167 BCE. And on that cliffhanger, we'll stop and carry on next time. But if in the meantime, there's your date, the 18th of June, if in the meantime you would like to read ahead of me, then enjoy the story of this next 3 years before the death of Antiochus IV and its impact on Jerusalem. You can find it, it's a very, very chatty style, easy to read, in the second book of Maccabees. And it lasts from chapter... Now, where did I put it? I had it somewhere. Yes, it is. The second book of Maccabees, which is in the Apocrypha, of course, chapter 4, verse 7, as far as chapter 10, verse 9. And that's not too long a read, but it will put you into the atmosphere that I shall be talking about next time. So thank you for coming, thank you for listening, and see you anon. Goodbye.